Hello, everybody. It is Saturday, November the 2nd, 2024. We're back on the FT Books of the Year, 6 books on the short list for this illustrious prize. And today we're talking to the author of an intriguing new book, Growth, A History and a Reckoning, Daniel Susskind. As it happens, yesterday, I had another British author on the show, John Moynihan. He has a book, Return to Growth. It's not on the FT shortlist, but it actually got a nice review in the FT. Very different take on growth. And this is what John Moynihan said to me when I told him I was going to be talking today with Daniel Susskind.
And his father were both associated with Balliol College, Oxford, that I also went to and had a lot to do with over the years. So I knew them both. It's the most left-wing college in Oxford, and there's a lot of stuff that I feel is fairly magical thinking about how we don't need. Tell that to the couple of billion people around the world who are living in poverty right now, that they don't need growth. Of course they need growth. And there are many, many countries around the world that are far richer than we have here in the UK, and are continuing. It's no problem, and it's very good for the people. And it's all very well if you're a relatively pampered Oxford don living the life of ease to say that more growth is a bad thing. But try and tell that for somebody who's just starting out in life, who's going to get married and have kids.
Well, Daniel, are you a pampered Oxford don in your attitude to growth?
Yeah. There's two very interesting things about that. One is, I think most people wouldn't really think of Balliol as being particularly left-wing. If you
unless you're a Thatcherite
minister. The Boris Johnson, of course, is perhaps our or the college's most famous alumni of the last few years, and he certainly isn't left-wing. The other, I'm afraid, big mistake there, of course, is that, and it betrays, I'm afraid, that John hasn't read my book, is that my starting point is that growth is a fantastic thing. We desperately need more growth. In fact, the book is, in part a reaction against exactly the movement that John is ascribing to me, the degrowth movement, the idea that the way to solve the sorts of problems that growth presents us with is to press pause on growth or even go into reverse. As I write in the book, I think that would be one of the most misplaced acts of self-harm that humankind could inflict upon themselves. So I think John and I might find ourselves in violent agreement on that.
Yeah, I have to admit, I'm probably a bit unfair. I perhaps presented you slightly unfairly to John, and I did it without giving him time to prepare. As you say, your book is in some ways a challenge to the degrowth movement. We've had a couple of the leading figures on the degrowth movement on the show. Tim Jackson, I'm sure you're very familiar with his book, Post-Growth, and also Jason Hickel, another founding member of the degrowth movement. His latest book is Less is More. Would it be fair to say, Daniel, that your book is somewhere in between Moynihan and his Thatcherite attitude to the importance of growth and the Jacksons and the Hickels of the world?
I think that's right. And I think, in a way, the argument of the book is that although John's view and Jason's view and Tim's view are very different, actually they're making the same fundamental mistake, which is to focus on only one part of the growth story and neglect the other. So each side is either focusing too much on the benefits of growth, which are extraordinary, and neglecting the immense price of growth, or contrary, the degrowthers are focusing far too much on the costs of growth and neglecting the immense price. And so what we have to do is find a way to chart a path between these two extremes, and that's what I'm trying to do in the book.
Give us a narrative of the history of growth. You're presented as an Oxford economist, but you're not a quantitative economist. You have I think, some philosophy in your work, some politics. You're certainly very interested in environmentalism too. What is the history of growth? Who's the founder of the idea of growth? Is it intimately bound up with the growth, so to speak, of the science of economics from Smith onward?
I mean, so I'm very interested in sort of intellectual history, and particularly in this book, the history of the idea of economic growth. I mean, what's very interesting is that before the 1950s, almost no economists, politicians, policymakers, anyone really was talking about the idea of economic growth. And you mentioned there Smith. It's what people often say in response to that. Well, hold on, Smith, Ricardo, Marx, Malthus. Surely they were talking about growth, and to some extent they were. But what united all of them, and Marx was the exception, really. What united all of them was a belief that growth would eventually fizzle out. All the classical economists thought this way, that our economies were necessarily trending towards some what they called stationary state. The idea that growth could go on indefinitely is an incredibly modern phenomenon. And again, so before the 1950s, no one really is taking this idea seriously. And this is what's fascinating, I think, even if people had decided they wanted to pursue economic growth, they wouldn't have been able to, because before the early 1940s, there was really no reliable measure of how large the economy was, whether it was growing, and if so, by how much. That number, what we call today gross domestic product, was only invented in the early 1940s.
GDP, of course, otherwise known gross domestic product. I'm sure you've
That's
heard, right. Daniel, there's an election going on in the US, and the numbers this morning on the Biden presidency aren't very good when it comes to growth and jobs, at least for this month. I wonder whether this fetish with growth is bound up in the need in democratic politics, with its focus on trying to quantify everything, that without the number crunchers, without the marketers taking over politics, this fetish with growth would never have happened.
So I think that's part of the story, which is that there's something sort of reassuringly kind of precise about a growth number. And we saw it in the UK in the last few days, the Office of Budget Responsibility publishing reports that specified what growth would be in a few years' time to 1 decimal point. You know, that's a kind of, you know, confidence inspiring precision. And so I think it's understandable that politicians and policymakers like to turn towards those sorts of numbers. But in a way, I think that's to do down, and this is, I think, what John was getting at in those opening comments, what really created the appetite for the pursuit of economic growth in the 20th century. You know, in the beginning, it's true that what created the appetite for growth was actually war. You know, the reason the GDP number was created in the 1940s was because the British government wanted to know how much money they could take out of their economy and dedicate to the war effort, and how much they needed to keep for citizens at home. They turned to the economists and said, how much can we do it? And the economists said, we don't have a reliable measure, that we don't have a number. And they turned to John Maynard Keynes to come up with, in the UK.
I thought it would have been Keynes. We did a show a couple of weeks ago with Skidelsky, actually, on Keynes and growth and AI. So it all sort of comes together.
Well, Keynes is the sort of one of the unsung heroes, actually, in the sort of history of the idea of growth. He's not often associated with GDP. It's often his colleague Simon Kuznets in the United States. But Keynes plays a really important role. So it's the Second World War that puts GDP on the map. What then puts growth on the map, what makes the pursuit of economies which are bigger and bigger and bigger, is actually the Cold War. Because in the Cold War, there's no traditional metrics of success. Soldiers lost and won, weapons destroyed, territory lost and gained. And so what becomes a kind of proxy measure for who's winning the Cold War are the US and the Soviet Union's respective GDP numbers, whether they're getting bigger or smaller. So it's actually, you know, first war, hot, then cold, that creates the appetite for growth. What then happens, though, is the sort of demands of the Cold War fade away. It turns out that this thing that people were pursuing fundamentally for sort of military ends turns out to be associated with almost every measure of human flourishing. And so as the demands of war fall away, this GDP measure and the pursuit of growth sort of stubbornly remain behind. And so I think it's to do down the promise of growth, to simply ascribe its sort of priority to its sort of its sort of satisfying quantification. I think that's part of it, but I think the wider intellectual history is far more, I think, interesting and important.
Yeah, and it seems to be bound up in how we conceptualize both the achievements of capitalism and of democracy. You've written about what you call the messy truth, and as you said, you're somewhere between Moynihan and Jackson and Hickel on all this stuff. You wrote an interesting piece about how we need to change the nature of growth for the IMF. Is the problem, Daniel, more of quantification? So if we were able to incorporate, say, growth in terms of the destruction of the universe, not the universe, the destruction of the environment and of the planet, and if we were able to quantify the impact on our own health, mentally and otherwise, for being overworked, might growth be more useful, or do you reject the idea of being able to quantify the idea of growth, or whatever other word we use to describe its opposite?
So the book Growth: A Reckoning is about what I call the growth dilemma. So there's tension between the promise of growth, as I said, that it's associated with almost every measure of human flourishing, but then also the sort of immense price of growth. Most of the time, as you're suggesting there, it's kind of it's framed in environmental terms, that we're kind of growing towards an ecological catastrophe. And
this is the Hickel, I mean, particularly,
and Tim Jackson as well. And part of the argument of the book is actually that these figures are probably underestimating the price of growth. It's not simply damaging the environment, which it is, but it's also leading to wider inequalities in society. It's encouraging us to pursue technologies like AI, whose disruptive effects on work and politics it's not clear we can control, and that's what I've worked on traditionally in the past. And it's also our pursuit of growth undermining the health of particular local places and communities that rely on specific industries. So I think the price of growth is far broader. And one response, I think you're exactly right, to this growth dilemma is to say, well, look, what we need to do is find a better way of measuring what we're pursuing. We need to take this GDP measure and make it a better measure of what we value. And there are kind of basically two sets of complaints that people make about GDP. One is a kind of set of technical complaints, that it's meant to be a measure of activity that takes place in a market, and it's not a particularly good measure of that. And there's lots of examples of this. If you think about many of the technologies we use today, whether it's a search engine, whether it's a generative AI system, they're often made available for free. And things that don't come with a price don't appear in the GDP statistics unless we make some, do some statistical contortions. The other issue, big issue, is that GDP measures are very bad at capturing quality. If you pick up your smartphone today, it might be the same price as a smartphone, say, 5 years ago, but in terms of its capabilities, its qualities, it's sort of incomparable. So there's a whole set, and I could go on, there's a whole set of sort of technical complaints about GDP, but the more kind of substantial complaints are the worries, not kind of technical complaints, but moral complaints, a sense that the GDP measure doesn't really value what we ought to value as a society. And there are some who say, exactly in the spirit that you're saying or suggesting, that what we ought to do then is to think about, we statisticians and economists should have a good think about what it is that we value, if not growth, things like the state of the environment, the level of inequality in society. And we ought to try and measure those things as well. and then we ought to bundle them all together in some sort of GDP plus, some kind of improved GDP figure, and we ought to pursue that instead. And the argument I make in the book is that actually, I think, fine, let's repair those technical shortcomings, but the idea that we can also repair these moral limitations of the measure, I think, is just completely misguided. And the reason I think it's misguided, and this is one of the important themes of the book, is that these questions about what else we ought to value, if not growth, say the environment, say inequality, say the health of local place and communities, and how much we ought to value them, those are some of the hardest questions we can ask, and they invite immense disagreement. And the place for engaging with those questions is not in statistical offices and central government treasuries. It's not to be handled by economists and technocrats. It's a question for citizens. And one of my pleas and one of my proposals in the book is that we ought to try and return more and more of these questions about what it is that we value, and when we face difficult trade-offs between the pursuit of prosperity and other things we might care about, we've got to try and return them to politics.
Yeah, and I want to come to politics, but in
Sure.
many ways, you said you're obviously very interested and very well versed in intellectual history. In many ways, is the issue are the issues that you're bringing up, this challenge and problem with quantifying anything, they're just a return or a repeat to John Stuart Mill's critique of his godfather, the utilitarian Jeremy Bentham, and his critique of utilitarianism. And the utilitarians, of course, including Mill's father, attempted to try to quantify everything into pleasure and pain and whatever outcome was beneficial to society. But Mill pointed out that it's actually a lot more complicated. Are you really doing the same thing when it comes to GDP?
Yeah, that's
I'm not
interesting.
suggesting you're, of course, John Stuart Mill, although you're also from a very dynamic family. I'm sure your father wasn't quite as much of a bully as Jeremy Mill.
Yeah, the stories of I wasn't speaking Greek at 5, I think, was the ridiculous thing.
James Mill, not Jeremy Mill. Sorry.
Yeah, I think there's questions about what this issue that many of the things we measure are not valuable from a social point of view, and many of the socially valuable things we can't measure. I'm sort of sympathetic to that. My argument is that really, though, the complaint I have about these efforts is not that what's going on is an issue of mismeasurement. What's going on is that these are really difficult moral questions about what really matters, and they ought not, to assume that they're the sorts of things that statisticians or economists or policymakers ought to be measuring in the first place is to make really important moral assumptions about what it is that we ought to value and care about. There's huge disagreement about many approaches to climate change, to reducing or increasing inequality in society, to whether you ought to allow particular local industries to collapse or you ought to support them to protect the meaning and purpose that comes from particular types of work. In particular, these are really important moral questions, and the idea that we can somehow measure seems to me to ignore the fact that these are moral disagreements that we ought to thrash out in politics.
Yeah, I take your point on work and politics, but what about when it comes to the environment? I know you've done a great deal of thinking. You had an interesting piece about the great decoupling, economic growth and the environment. You argue shouldn't necessarily be in conflict, but when it comes to the environment, can't one quantify? We've had many shows with writers and experts on the climate who suggest that the destruction of the environment, carbon costs should be built in not only to the price of things, but also to quote unquote terms like GDP. Is there no way we can do this?
So I think we can do it. The question is, should we do it? We can do it from a technical point of view, but from a moral point of view, is it the right thing to do? And, my own view is that we need to do far more to reduce that. You just showed that article, The Great Decoupling. We need to do far more to decouple emissions from growth. We need to continue the extraordinary story of the last few decades of developing technologies that allow us to continue to grow without damaging the environment at the same time. But the question, how much should we value the environment, and how much should we value it relative to other things that we care about? Those are really hard moral questions, and there's lots of disagreement about them. And you can see that already. There is simmering discontent in this country, for instance, about the pursuit of net zero. And you can see it far more starkly in the United States. Unless we put these questions about growth and about climate and all the other prices associated with growth back to politics, there is a risk we are not going to bring large parts of our respective countries with us as we do the sorts of difficult and costly and challenging changes that are required to both grow and also not destroy the environment. So again, these are. It's a mistake to think that these are kind of technical problems that we can simply solve by measuring things in a different or more accurate way. These are moral disagreements.
Moral or political.
Yeah.
You've mentioned politics a couple of times. You have a very well-known brother, Jamie Susskind. He's been on the show before, an expert on digital politics. He's been on the show a couple of times talking about how a digital republic could deepen democracy and compound freedom in the 21st century. He has an interesting book out called Future Politics. Is the problem, in part, Daniel, when it comes to growth, that the political parties haven't caught up? So we have the John Moynahans and the Tories of the world who just fetishize growth and argue that anyone who's against it is some sort of left-wing Balliol tyrant. And then perhaps socialists or skeptics like Tim Jackson and Jason Hickel who reject the idea of capitalism entirely. Do we need new political parties able to put the complexity of the issues of growth, as you say in the title, this reckoning, which isn't clear? Your book is not either a polemic for or against growth. Are we missing political parties? It always seemed to me as if the European Greens were the first new party, post-war, post-Second World War party, to actually begin to address these, although it doesn't always seem to have been success. In the UK, you still got very traditional parties, and the same as in the US, two-party systems. Do we need new parties, new political language to be able to incorporate this all-important theme?
Yeah. I mean, you asked, or you sort of made the observation that people might not have quite caught up or might have missed something. I think one of, and part of what I'm trying to do in the book is correct some sort of common misunderstandings about the intellectual history of growth, how growth works. But I think one of the most important things for kind of political leaders and policymakers is that very often when people talk about economic growth, the kind of metaphor they have in mind is that the economy is a bit like a train, and they're sitting in the, in the driver's seat, and they can sort of push forward on the throttle and go faster, or pull back and go slower.
Yeah, it's Marx's locomotive of history. That
and exactly, and in that spirit, the kind of direction of travel is set. It's predetermined by the rails that are set down for us to trundle along. And the only question is, do we want more or less growth? And so people like John say we want more. People like Tim and Jason say we want less. And I'm stylizing, but that's the dimension in which the debate takes place. And I'm saying actually a far better metaphor is a nautical one. We're sitting in a boat, and we can put up our masts and go faster, or we can put them down and go slower. But we can also, the direction of travel is far more open. There are many possible directions our economy can take. The choice is not simply, do we want more or less growth, but it's also, do we want a different type of growth as well? And I think the big difference between me and those other positions that you mentioned is that I'm far more ambitious about the possibility that we have to change the nature of growth. I think there are ways for us to pursue growth without destroying those other valuable things that we care about, whether it's the environment, whether it's the level of equality in society, whether it's the health of local places and communities. And so a big part of the book, a big practical part of the book, is not simply how we get more growth, which I think is really important, but also how we change the nature of growth, how we can change the incentives that people face in society, so we develop technologies that don't simply make us more prosperous, but also don't trash these other valuable things that we care about.
Yeah, and your previous books, you wrote one with your father, The Future of the Professions, I thought was a very good book. And you've written a book called A World Without Work. A lot of your quote unquote work before focuses on the future of work, and particularly technologies. You've talked already, or you've touched on AI. I noted on your X page, Daniel, that there's an image of, I think it's a Cézanne painting, probably set in the south of France, very relaxing. Are you suggesting that when it comes to growth, work or the absence of work is critical? Because we all complain about working too hard, and then we get upset if GDP doesn't grow. How bound up in the future of GDP and this obsession with economic growth is the future of work and the role of technology in that work?
So the running theme through all my work is technology. I mean, although this is a book about growth, a level down, it's fundamentally a book about technology. Because in my view, what drives economic growth primarily is technological progress. And those previous books are looking at the impact of technology in one particular part of our economic lives, namely the labor market, the work that we do. And this book is looking at the impact of technology more generally on society. I should say that, one of the things that sort of made me initially attracted me to this new terrain was the observation that many people in the world of artificial intelligence, which I'd spent, more than a decade in, were talking the same way about technology as those in the environmental movement. The people who were saying we ought to press pause on progress in AI or even slow it down sounded very, very similar to those in the environmental movement who said we needed to press pause on, other types of technologies or even, stop using them altogether. That there was an interesting analogy between how these different groups, operating quite differently, were nevertheless talking the same way about how we ought to respond to the price of technological progress. And in both cases, I thought they were making the same mistake. And so what I tried to do in this new book is kind of gather together all the different prices associated with growth and ask, is there a way to think more generally about how we might change the sorts of technologies we develop in society so we don't have these harmful consequences?
And what was the conclusion? More or less AI?
Different type of AI. So, if you think about the sort of labor market context, for instance, which is, as you noted before, where I've spent 10, 15 years thinking and writing, very broadly, technology can have two effects on the labor market. Either technologies can substitute for workers, displacing them from particular tasks and activities, and those are the sorts of cinematic stories that we hear about every day in the popular press, stories of systems and machines taking on new tasks and activities we thought only human beings could do, making medical diagnoses, writing jokes, designing buildings, composing news reports, all of that stuff. But technology can also have a very different effect. It can also complement human workers. It can also make them, it can also increase the demand for people to do tasks and activities that haven't yet been automated. And so the story of technological progress and the story of the impact of automation on the labor market is the story of the battle between these two forces, this harmful substituting force that eats away at the demand for workers, and this helpful complementing force that increases the demand for workers. And there's one view which says, well, look, there's not much we can do. These technologies are becoming more powerful. That battle is a sort of foregone conclusion. There's another view that says, no, we can actually step in and try and shape the sorts of technologies that we develop. So, in the US, for instance, in every single year since 1981, the US tax system has, well, the effective tax rate on hiring a worker has been higher than using a machine. In other words, the US tax system creates a very strong incentive to automate the work that people do. And so you might say, well, look, if work is something that we think is valuable, not simply because it provides people with an income, but also perhaps provides them with meaning and purpose, then we ought to step in and try and change the direction of technological progress, redirect it away from substituting for workers towards complementing them. That's the spirit of what I'm going on about in the book, that we need to think not simply about, do we want more or less technological progress, but do we want different types of technological progress, and how might we go about in practice achieving that?
I mean, do you think there could be a moment in the future where we celebrate shrinking growth? You had an interesting piece in the London Times recently about the diet pill Ozempic. You argue it can save the NHS, it can allow people to lose weight and therefore improve their own personal health. If we go from the personal to the political, or from the personal to the public, is there equivalents of Ozempic in the public sphere where the economy can be shrunk to everyone's benefit?
I mean, the reason the Ozempic thing I found so fascinating was because people get very excited. That first book that I wrote, The Future of the Professions, one of the professions I wrote a lot about was the healthcare profession. Thought a lot about the future of health and the future of medicine. And over the last 10 years, people have got very excited about, AI-powered diagnostics and, virtual wards and things like that. And the argument of that piece was really, we ought to be just as excited about this new technology, namely Ozempic. We don't think of it as being a technology, but it very much is, and we ought to be, treating it with that same sort of interest.
I mean, let me just sort of think this thing through a bit. I mean, there used to be a time where large bodies were celebrated. The fatter you were, the healthier or you were viewed as healthy and wealthy and successful. Yeah. These days, it's the rich and powerful who are the thinnest. So might that metaphor be extended to societies in an odd kind of way?
So my view, if you're asking, is there a sort of slimmer version of the economy? My view is, and this is where the optimism comes from in the book, is that we're really just at the beginning of human economic history. For 300,000 years, economic life was essentially stagnant. So whether you're a hunter-gatherer in the Stone Age or someone laboring away at the start of the Industrial Revolution, your lives would have differed in lots of respects. But fundamentally, from an economic point of view, it would have been very similar. You are both likely to have been stuck in a relentless struggle for subsistence. So modern economic growth, the sort of growth that we take for granted today, only began about 200 years ago. In the sort of
with capitalism. I mean, well, certainly the capitalism that Marx and I guess Smith observed.
Yeah, in the 1780s, the Industrial Revolution. It begins here in Britain, and it's it's extraordinary moment, and it just seems so unimaginative to me to think that the current economic peak is the best that we could ever do. That we ought to press pause on growth, not simply now or for the next 10 or 100 years, but for all time to come. And the spirit of my book is that really we're only getting started, and that the sort of possibilities for technological progress and for economic growth and for transforming, the lives of human beings on this planet is immense. And again, it just seems, in my view, very unimaginative of the degrowth movement to think that that this is the moment to press pause.
Final question, Daniel. It's a very, very important subject. We'll have to get you back on the show. So much more to talk about. I want to steal all your time. I wonder, though, in reality, for better or worse, we live in what I'm calling, or what I'm coining, the post. It's certainly not my term. The post-growth age. in the sense that no one really takes GDP very seriously anymore. There was an excellent piece in this week's New Yorker by Nicholas Lehman on Bidenomics. It's a long piece, and it makes the point, a very convincing point, that Biden's economic reforms have profoundly changed America, for better or worse, mostly for the better, because the New Yorker, of course, is pro-Biden, pro-Democrat. But there's no doubt about it that trillions of dollars have been invested in the American economy, and those benefits are gonna already being manifested. But the reality of the election next week is nobody acknowledges that. Trump doesn't, of course, because he has a counter narrative, but Harris doesn't either. In other words, in this kind of, I don't know what you call it, surreal political age of authoritarianism or post-liberalism, whatever you want to call it, does anyone, apart from a few Balliol College economists, does anyone take GDP very seriously, at least in the political sphere? Does it even matter anymore?
So I make two observations. The first is, I think where it matters more than ever is in the developing world. So if for instance you take the degrowth movement to mean freezing global GDP per head at its current level, so that's going to mean in practice condemning 800 million people to extreme poverty. If you don't like that idea, you're going to have to find a way to slash the incomes of the 7.1 billion people that remain, almost all of the Western world. So the idea that we could press pause on growth in the developing world, or indeed somehow, press pause on growth and slash the incomes of those in the West in order to, it's a non-starter. So for me, where growth matters more than ever is in the developing world. It's key to solving many of the sorts of problems that we managed to solve through growth in the second half of the 20th century. In the developed world, I think what this observation, and I think it's absolutely critical, which is that there is a sort of mismatch between how economists and policymakers look at the state of the economy, GDP numbers are good, and how people actually feel about the economy. And what that tells us is that there is something that these numbers aren't capturing. There are other things that we think are valuable and important in life that these headline figures, which suggest a sort of rosy economic picture, are not adequately capturing. And that really is the thrust of the book, that for too long we have neglected the other prices associated with growth, and we need to do more to try and capture those in our political conversations and political deliberations. And the idea that we can do this simply by tinkering and tweaking with the GDP measure, I think is a big mistake.
Well, that's The Reckoning in Growth, Daniel Suskind's new book. It's also a history. It's perhaps the most important subject these days. I'm surprised more people haven't written this kind of book, between the John Moynahans of the world and the Tim Jacksons and Jason Hickles. It's shortlisted for the FT Book of the Year. It'd be one of my favorites. Have you got a speech yet? Have you prepared a speech, Daniel, for the awards? I think they're in the beginning of December in London.
I haven't prepared a speech. That would be...
that might be a bit cheeky, presumptuous. I think you have as good a chance as anyone, which is saying really you have as bad a chance as anyone. We can't quantify these things. Daniel Susskind, real honor to have you back on. To have you, I would say, back. That your brother's been on the
Susskind back on. Yeah.
We'll have to get you back. I think I also want to get your father, your sister, and your mother. Quite a family of Suskins. Congratulations, Daniel, on the book and on the shortlisting of the book. And best of luck with the awards in December. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me.